right. Well, good afternoon and good early evening. Welcome to the Focus, The Rivers Within Us, Journeys Across Intersectional Identities. My name is Joe Rolón, and I am the Director of Student Life for Butler College. I am the co-president of Latino Princetonians, and I'm the opening act for tonight's event. Today's event is part of Focus. Focus is a central part of a university-wide effort to combat systemic racism. Princeton is recommitting itself to replacing institutional racism with institutional anti-racism. This cannot be accomplished half-heartedly or passively. It requires attention, effort, and dedication. Focus is intended to keep anti-racism at the center of campus discourse and to ensure that this effort remains a priority in the mind of every Princetonian. So Professor Christina Lee of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese will host a conversation with writer and journalist Jordan Salama, class of 2019, to discuss stories of journeys that cross cultures, borders, and identities in the Americas and beyond. Professor Lee was born in South Korea and raised in Argentina. She teaches a range of undergraduate and graduate courses in her department and is the author of several books, most recently, Saints of Resistance, Devotions in the Philippines under Early Spanish Rule. She also teaches every fall a course on identity in the Spanish-speaking world, where they explore and interrogate identity constructions in Spain, Latin America, and Spanish-speaking communities in the United States. An American writer of Argentine, Syrian, and Iraqi Jewish descent, Jordan Salama regularly produces essays and stories for publications such as National Geographic, The New York Times, and Scientific American. His reporting has taken him as far as the steppes of Kazakhstan and as near as Queens, New York, and his first book, Every Day the River Changes, 4 Weeks Down the Magdalena, was named a Kirkus Best Nonfiction Title of 2021 and chronicles a journey along Colombia's greatest waterway. Jordan was also Professor Lee's thesis advisee, and the thesis he wrote turned into Every Day the River Changes. Thank you for joining us, and please welcome Jordan Salama and Professor Lee.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah? You can hear us?
Can you hear me? Okay. Let's see. All right. I first need to show Jordan's pieces. Which is my pride and joy. And, the book now that you guys have, I actually read it again. Have a lot of Post-it notes because I was very interested in knowing what changed, and I really loved all the changes. I wanted to, is it okay? Can you hear me if I sit down? I think I'm supposed to be sitting down and looking very comfortable. Okay, so let me begin with a story from Class A 2019. I think this was the last pre-COVID Class Day we had in person. Jordan came to the Class Day receptions for Spanish and Portuguese, which is his concentration, and the Latin American Studies program. And needless to say that he won many awards, as he was, as you expected, one of our top students. And this is where I met his family. I knew that Jordan's paternal grandparents had come from Argentina and that they still had connections with the Sephardic Jewish community there in Buenos Aires, which is, as you heard, where I grew up. But what was truly shocking to me at the time was to learn from his grandmother, who still has a very strong porteño accent, that she used to live in the same neighborhood where I grew up, about 3 decades before my family set foot in Buenos Aires. She could locate exactly where my house had been, and I could locate exactly where hers was in my neighborhood, El Barrio Flores. Although this story seems to be one of freakish coincidence, it was not entirely so after I actually thought about it. I grew up in a part of Buenos Aires that was safe for Koreans to live and do business in the 1970s and 80s, partly because of the Jewish community that was already there. My family was able to enter the garment industry because my mother was taught the business by a Jewish man who trusted her to design her clothes he sold in his store. The story of affinity and collaboration between Jews and Koreans is one story that has yet to be told, and it is one example of many other stories of intersectionality in Latin America. This is why I teach my course on identity in the Spanish-speaking world. In my course, my students and I examine the multidimensional identities that we find in Latin America, in Spain, and in Spanish-speaking communities in the United States. And we learn that diversity and intersectionality have been ever present from the earliest times in these regions. As a journalist, Jordan has also been telling us about communities in Latin America that defeat expectations and prejudices. The way I see it, both Jordan and I are in the business of exploring communities that are little known and are misunderstood. This type of realization does not come easily. It should seem obvious that when I first conceived my course on identity about 5 years ago, part of me was interested in telling others that there are people in Latin America who look like me and who speak Spanish, and that we're very normal people. But it wasn't evident to me until much later. Let me turn to you, Jordan, now, and share that when you started working with me on your thesis, now book, you were hesitant to engage with the question of identity. Can you tell us when and how you began to engage more seriously with the question in your writing, and how it changed throughout the course of revising the thesis into a book? I also like you to read from a part of your book that I consider to be a watershed moment. And actually, this is a part that you developed afterwards. So it's a part that was not in the thesis. And I think this is where you offer a lot of insights about your identity.
So first of all, thank you all for coming. This is amazing to see how many people are interested in hearing us speak about these topics that, like Christina mentioned, maybe are a little bit misunderstood and people don't know much about. So this is a really wonderful opportunity. And thank you for the introduction too, because that was very kind and generous and very interesting to hear about the connections between all of these different communities in America. So to give a sense of where I come from, I was born in New York, born and raised in the US, but my family kind of comes from everywhere. We are Arabic-speaking Jews from Syria and Iraq that made their way to the US by way partially through Latin America. And I did not want to write about that for a very, very long time. I think that throughout the thesis project, something that Christina was pushing me to do was to write about myself in the context of a place, Colombia, that I really have nothing to do with. I'm not Colombian. My family is not from Colombia, but I think that what Christina noticed well before I did was that there are deep similarities in what goes on in many of these communities along the Magdalena to the very communities where our families come from, where Christina was raised, and where my grandparents and their siblings and my cousins still live today. So it's a very uncomfortable thing, I think, to write about yourself and to write about your identity, because you don't know how that's going to be perceived by other people, especially when that identity is something that's misunderstood or confusing or hard to explain because people maybe don't necessarily know what it's all about. So anyway, in this back and forth of this thesis process where I was writing about this kind of random river that I had come across kind of by coincidence, at Christina's urging, I think that I was beginning to realize that there was this moment of I was finding my traces of my own family and traces of my own identity in a place that was very far from me in kind of every sense of the term. So on that, I guess reading is always another weird thing when you read something that you've written, just like it's strange to write about yourself. But I will read this part. And to give some context, I show up in an oil town along the Magdalena River called Barranca Bermeja. This book, it has been mentioned, I think, is a journey down the Rio Magdalena in Colombia, in which I stay with the people who live along its banks and write a book that kind of reflects on a country's transition out of 50 years of conflict. So I'm in this town called Barranca Bermeja, which is a gritty oil port. I have no intention of staying for any significant period of time. I'm there to pick up a ferry to get to the next area. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, if I remember, you were staying at the Radisson.
Yeah,
And you were in a cab, and you told the cab driver that you were staying at the Radisson.
exactly.
And he expressed disapproval. And he said,
Right, so everywhere I went, I tried to stay with families, but in this specific town, I had nobody to kind of take me in, and so I booked a room at like a random hotel. It happened to be this Radisson, and I'm in the taxi going to this place, and he's like, shakes his head, he says, "What a shame that you didn't stay at the Hotel Pipaton, the crown jewel of the Magdalena. It's closing forever tomorrow." And so of course I'm like, okay, well, I have to show up at this place that's literally going to be gone the next day. And so I get there and I start talking to the manager of this hotel in Spanish, and I'm like, well, you know, what's your deal? Where are you from? Blah, blah. He says, oh, I'm from Queens. And I said, no way, I live 20 minutes from Queens. That's crazy. And in that kind of conversation, he begins asking me questions about myself, which is kind of a common thread throughout this book, what people are asking. I see a sign. Am I supposed to pay attention to this?
You're supposed to unmute your mic.
Unmute my mic. Do I talk? How do I do that?
Oh, it's on the.
It's on the bottom.
It's on the
Sorry,
screen.
people.
Can you guys hear me though? I mean, is that okay?
We can hear you.
Hold on one second. Let me unmute this.
This is supposed to be more subtle. I
Yeah, no, I know.
apologize.
See, I have to ask you something. I have no idea. How about now?
Is that good?
Is this good? Better? Can you guys hear me anyway? Is that okay? I mean, yeah?
yeah, I think, yeah.
Okay.
Is this unmuted?
It's unmuted. Okay, good. All right. So anyway, this guy Oscar, the manager of this hotel, is from Queens. He's also Colombian. Obviously, he was born in Colombia, went to Queens, came back to Colombia, somehow ended up managing this hotel that's completely failing and closing the next day. And suddenly he wants to know, who are you and why in the world are you in Barranca Bermeja, Colombia? And so what I say is something along these lines where I say, it's not that I hadn't gotten used to these kinds of questions before. I first fielded them on my original trip to Colombia. This was when after I was a freshman at Princeton, and the Spanish department funded me to go for a, like kind of an informal internship. Anyway, I first fielded them on my original trip to Colombia. As I lay in the hammocks with Colo and Vismar and Ladrilleros, the questions continued in San Agustin, in Estación Cocorná, and now in Barranca Bermeja. Questions about why I'd come inevitably brought follow-ups about who I was, and these answers were less clear. Was I Argentine? My accent revealed it, but something was off. Where was I from? New York. That made more sense. And my last name, Salama, what was it? Arabic, Middle Eastern, okay, there were people with that name in Colombia too, but what was my religion? Though my answer to this question was certain, it was often the trickiest one, for every Jew knows that we are sometimes unwelcome. I often take to thinking about how I came to be such an ethnic and cultural mixed bag. My mother's ancestors thrived among the once wealthy and prominent Jewish community in Baghdad, but she and her family fled a world of religious persecution, of baseless hangings and jailings, and came to New York in the 1970s with very little. My paternal great-grandparents, working-class Jews from Damascus and Aleppo, facing forced non-Muslim military conscription by the Ottomans in the early 1900s, escaped by ship to Buenos Aires, where my grandparents grew up poor, sometimes even hungry. My grandfather, the first in his family to attend a university, received his MD in Argentina. He married my grandmother, and they moved to Brooklyn. And my parents met by some stroke of fate in the cafeteria line during their own first week of medical school in Manhattan. As the children of a Syrian-Argentine father and an Iraqi mother in the New York suburbs, my brothers and I grew up around Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew. But because my parents' single common tongue was English, that was the language of our house. Only once I started studying it in middle school did the broken pieces of my spoken Spanish finally come together. And as an aside, I think that that's the case for a lot of people who grow up in kind of this sort of situation. I continue to say, perhaps the most American thing about me is that at home in the United States, where I was born and I have lived my entire life, I've always felt slightly out of place. So, strange as it is, I've found that the more I travel to communities themselves out of the way and misunderstood, the more I'm forced to explain myself over and over again to different kinds of people who I meet, the better sense I'm able to make of my own identity once I'm back home. That, perhaps, was one of the main reasons why I was drawn in by Colombia, the Magdalena, and places like Barranca Bermeja. So maybe that then is what Christina was referencing, is this moment where suddenly I feel comfortable writing about myself,
and talking about my background as it relates to this book that maybe in other ways has nothing to do with me.
Yes, and what was it how difficult was it? I mean, I assume it must have been, it's not easy to write about yourself in this way.
Yeah.
How did it come together? This part was not part of the thesis, and I was just really moved to tears when I read it because I kind of went, yes, this is what we've been talking about.
Right, because I think that so much of what you're taught as a journalist is not to insert yourself into the narrative of this kind of story, because you're writing and centering other people. This book is, I just read you one of the only parts of this book that's really only about me, but the vast majority of this book is actually other people's stories as the central focus of the story. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to write about yourself, but I think that in so many different cases, like in this kind of writing, which is creative nonfiction, you can call it travel writing, you can call it lots of other kinds of things, essay writing, kind of like memoir writing. I've come to realize that in this world of like low attention spans and people having so much content available to them to decide what they want to read and what they want to listen to, it is those little pieces that tie yourself to the story that are like connecting bridges that will allow somebody who maybe has no interest or doesn't realize they have any interest whatsoever in the Magdalena to pick up a book about it because they think, oh, somebody who is at least a little bit close to my life has a connection to this place, and maybe through his eyes I can understand what's going on here. So that was what I think finally led me to do this. But it was that people like Christina and my editor at the publisher and other professors that I've had who kind of chipped away at this idea that I should be writing about my own identity and writing about myself. And only at the very last minute of the editing process of this book did I finally get this specific page out. And I'm glad that I did now because it seems like it's something that people are paying attention to, which I could never have imagined in the first place.
I think that for this type of writing, it is important also to, speak of yourself, but also be willing to be vulnerable. I think when one wants to travel well and travel in a way that which you can learn about other people, you travel wanting to learn from others and letting them teach you, not the other way around. You need to be vulnerable. And there's a part also that I don't think it was in your thesis, and I don't know the exact pages. You speak of, this is a part in when you meet the tourists. You're
The tourists.
Yeah, this is in Estación Concorná. Do you know where it is?
Yeah, I could probably pull it out quickly, but do you want me to give the...
Yeah, so maybe that's just that one last section. We had not planned on this, but
Yeah.
I think this is a really nice part. It's in Estación Concorná. And you speak
Yes.
of how warm is the relationship between friends and family members there. And you talk about, you're reflecting on how, in comparison, life seems very cold in the United States. More individualistic, right? And then it's very hot, but it's very hot there. And so you have a number of sleepless nights. And then a group of tourists arrive. They're not American tourists, they're actually tourists from Medellin, and you describe them as light-skinned tourists. And this part, and then you speak of sort of coming to another realization. Do you mind reading that part, sharing?
Do you want me to read the part about the tourists or about the cold?
Well, maybe start with the tourists, yeah.
Sure. So,
or no, maybe start with
because the cold is the first.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, there's a lot going on. And to your earlier point about vulnerability, when you travel, I think to be vulnerable is important because in a lot of cases, I can't imagine doing something like this in the United States. I just don't think that it would work, knocking on people's doors and just asking them deeply personal questions about their lives and them like being willing to answer. That puts people in such a vulnerable position, I think just from the outset, is like being listened to is a vulnerable position to be in, because especially being listened to by a journalist who or at that time I was a student, but they knew I was writing about them. To know that somebody will be writing about what you tell them is a very difficult, I think, thing to produce when you're speaking to somebody. So that to the point of vulnerability. But yeah, this was a place where it's a tiny town along the banks of the river where not many people go. And it's called Estación Cocorná. And in Estación Cocorná, the temperatures regularly went above 95 degrees. It was so hot, like one of these places that like saps every piece of energy out of your body because it is just so oppressively hot. Even at night, I was laying on this like cot basically where I was sleeping in somebody's home, and I could not sleep because it was just so hot. But during the days, I noticed, and I say something to the extent of, let's see here. There on the riverbank, they sat in the shade of a large rubber tree beneath its colossal trunk and green leaves faded yellow. After the sun went down in the evenings, they would move their plastic chairs to the street where they ate dinner while listening to accordion music and chatting with their neighbors. When a place is warm, the people are warm too, I wrote in my journal of the life of the campesinos, the people of Colombia's countryside. I thought of life back home and how cold it was, how after work each day we locked ourselves in our houses and apartments and watched television until we went to bed. But for all of the days I stayed in Estación Cocorná, it never felt this way. I was enchanted by the thought of a life outside in this all-encompassing warmth of a life lived forever in the company of friends and family. Lately, I wondered if this was entirely true, and then I get into a section where I talk about the fact that this life living outside is actually backed by really unequal and oppressive conditions, I mean socially oppressive conditions that cause life to be this way. Also climate change, which is just going to make life in the places like this warmer and warmer and less sustainable and less sustainable. But this idea that like everything is backed by hardship and solitude, in the sense that a lot of people are sitting around outside all day because they have no work or they have no air conditioning or fans in their home that work very well to fend off this heat. So I was trying to ask myself this question of, am I romanticizing aspects of this life, which was important to question. And then to the part of the tourists where I didn't realize that there would be tourists at all kind of coming. Let's see. I guess I don't have to read that part, but
Well, I like this part. Well, I was kind of going to the part where you say, you see these tourists and then you say, I hated myself for feeling relieved.
yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah. Hold on. Sorry, everybody. This is on the spot.
Sorry.
Trying to
It's
remember.
because it's such a,
Yeah.
I think it's such a significant moment in the book.
Yep.
And it really says a lot about what it means, you know, this moment in which you realize that you are coming from a lot of privilege. And
Yes. Oh yeah, it's actually right after, yes, it's right after this section that I just read. So they were transporting a group of light-skinned Medellin day trippers who had come for a float down the river Cocorná, which is a tributary, in large inner tubes. Led by a young tour operator named Camilo, who wore a Boston Red Sox baseball cap and spoke perfect English, the tourists were as surprised to see me as I was to see them. After several sleepless nights in the insufferable heat, I hated myself for feeling relieved that outsiders had come, because they reminded me of an unspoken sense of freedom and privilege that we shared, the sense that, unlike the people who lived here, we could always leave. This made me deeply uncomfortable. And then I keep talking about other things. But this idea that as a reporter or as a journalist or as a person who seeks out stories, you have a license and a privilege to be able to go to places that are truly marked by lots of suffering and struggle and hardship, but you always have the option to leave, and oftentimes the people who you're speaking with do not have the opportunity to leave the situation that they're in, is a very challenging spot for everybody involved. And I think just that's one way that it I don't know, shows you kind of what goes into a project like this. And maybe many of you have had this experience too. I know that Princeton isn't doing travel anymore because of COVID, but like, I'm sure you have all been to different places, and I wonder if this is something that is a universal experience of being able to travel for pleasure, which in itself is a lucky, privileged thing to be able to do, as opposed to moving for reasons that are forced or for economic reasons or what have you.
yeah, I was very grateful that you incorporated that, because I think that part of traveling, you know, if you want to travel ethically, we need to be deeply uncomfortable and be willing to be deeply uncomfortable. So I was so pleased to see that, and also very moved. So maybe we can open it up to questions now. I think we've spoken enough. I'm sure you have questions for Jordan.
I'm happy to talk about anything. So I know that there's maybe people here from different kinds of student groups on campus. We could talk about identity. We could talk about the book. We could talk about writing. We could talk about anything that you
Yeah.
guys want. We could talk about the Spanish department and how awesome it is and how you should all study it because you can do things like follow a river in Colombia. So, no, yeah, yeah.
Thank you for that discussion of your talk. It's a really fascinating book. And I'm curious, like, so oftentimes we hear about how it's dangerous to report on issues related to extractive industries like oil or gold mining. And I'm wondering how you got past that to really be able to tell the stories of local people in their communities, and then just like the logistics of that process.
That's a good question. The question is that it's often dangerous to report on extractive industries like oil and gold mining and kind of environmental problems like that, especially I'll add in places like Colombia and in Latin America as a region. I think especially it's difficult. And how did I get past that? I think that doing this as a senior thesis project allowed me a certain kind of protection in a sense. First of all, because I was a student journalist, but I was very much trying to just immerse myself in people's lives and live with them and be in there with their families and in their houses. And so I wasn't necessarily coming into a place with hard-hitting questions from the outset about like these very controversial subjects. But of course it was all around me. There's an example early on in the book, which also of course didn't appear in my thesis because this happened on the day before I was presenting my thesis for the kind of Spanish department defense. But I journey into the Andes with a renowned Colombian anthropologist who takes me to see these megalithic statues from the 1st to 8th centuries AD. His name's Luis Manuel Salamanca. I spent several days with this man. He's also an environmental activist. And the day before I'm supposed to present my thesis to this colloquium, he's murdered. I find out that he's murdered. And I'm sitting in East Pine, right? I write in the book that I'm sitting in a room with these kinds of antique walls and doors that we're sitting in right now, right? Like that make you feel so much more important than you actually are until you find out about something like this. That this guy who is, working towards environmental and cultural preservation, really you would think that he wouldn't have much of a problem with anybody at all, is shot twice outside the front door of his house because of his activism. So that sort of thing is kind of a constant through this book that I know is around me. But luckily, for many reasons, I think, I'm insulated from it in a way that I think most working journalists for a news outlet, for example, like if you're from the New York Times, or that's maybe a bad example, but local journalists, if you're working for like El Tiempo or an outlet on the ground, you're less protected in the way that I think I was, also coming from the US and speaking Argentinian and Spanish. Like there's lots of factors. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for sharing. Yes, a follow-up question to that then. Is it enough as a journalist to give these people a platform? Or what is the responsibility of giving back to these communities once you're sharing their stories?
It's a really, really challenging question. And I think, unfortunately, for the world of journalism, in terms of financial support for communities, first of all, there's lots of ethical debates that go on about that, but also the world in which a book like this on a very specific topic makes the journalist or even the publishing company a large sum of money is pretty much non-existent. And so what are the different ways that we can work with the communities that are involved in the making of this book for more solutions to these problems? And I'm not quite sure what that answer is. What I've tried to do, again, being a 24-year-old who just published this book, is to try to get excerpts of the book published in places that are more widely read than maybe my book would be. So in a place like National Geographic or Smithsonian or the New York Times, such that these problems get even more exposure and these people get even more exposure than they would just in a book like this alone. I hope that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. I think in your book, you kind of highlight some of the goods and bads of travel. I mean, like on the one hand, you like burn kerosene to like go travel to far-flung places.
Yeah.
It's really a form of travel, especially international travel. It's really only available to like the top like 10% of people in the world. But on the other hand, like you get all this cultural exposure. You discover yourself. You discover the world. I think you become a better citizen for it. So like, what role do you see going forward for travel? How should we do that? I mean, going just beyond journalism, like, how should people go about traveling the world? That's a big question, I'm sorry. But.
Yeah, that is a big question. For those in the back, the question is, how do we travel, I guess, to condense your question, like how do we travel more responsibly, understanding the emissions that go into travel and all the other maybe problematic things that come with going to other places, but also balancing that with all the great things that do come from being in these kinds of interactions and having these kinds of encounters. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say that if possible, learn the language. I mean, Jordan was able to do this trip and go very far because he learned the language and he had to study the language. This is not something that came, you're not a heritage speaker. I mean, you grew up listening to some Spanish, but you didn't grow up learning Spanish. So he took courses, and so I think you get much more if you know the language than if you don't. So I would take that very seriously. There are many things that are just not translatable, and I think you can get to know people better if you know the language. In some cases, even if you don't speak the language at a near native level, people can see you're trying. They can see that you're making an effort, and I think there's great appreciation in that. I also would stay away from going to resorts and all-inclusives and all that, because generally you're just not exposed to the communities. Going to the food markets and going into the towns. I mean, Jordan did it right. He was very safe. I know this for sure. I checked, and he was very, very safe. So he was traveling to places that generally tourists don't go to, but always making sure that he knew he had a contact. I mean, you should speak about this, but he always made sure he had a contact in each of the places.
Yeah, in this case, I was traveling alone, but I was always received by somebody, as Christina's mentioning. And that's really important because I think that to your question of like how to make sure that the experience is the most fulfilling if there are all these also problems associated with it, is to make sure that you have a real tangible connection, a bridge to the world in which you're in so that you can operate in that world in a meaningful way. My way of doing that was with families. I think that, being around kids and elderly people at once is a really amazing thing, and so I really tried to seek out a lot of elderly people, especially along this river. But yeah, it all worked out because I made connections with people who I knew who had ties on the ground. And one example is that one of my friends from Princeton, her grandmother and uncle live along the banks of the Magdalena, and so I stayed with them. That's just one example, but in other cases, like, it would be that someone like that would call a friend who lives further downriver, and then I would end up going to spend time with them too. But I was calculated about it all because there were risks associated with it too.
And you talk about how your friend's uncle was expecting a more kind of traditional tourist, and he was very surprised at what you were trying to do. You wanted to know about the river, and that you were so curious about it and wanted to go into it. He thought you wanted to go to the amusement parks, right?
Yeah.
Which is what the tourists do there. So.
In Girardot, which is a town along the river, it's known kind of for its like resorts and water slides and stuff. Especially if people from Bogota will come and enjoy the water parks there because it's just so hot and it's like this place where people go to enjoy the sights. I asked Felipe, my friend's uncle, to take me to the butcher, to the abandoned wharf of the river, and to the like slimy fish market that literally nobody would ever want to go in there. It smelled so bad. It was like awful. But I think that he appreciated it because he was able to show me a side of the town that a lot of people just didn't make an effort to see. Yeah.
I travel a lot with students, and sometimes my students express a lot of guilt when we go into, less developed countries, and they feel a lot of guilt that they come with all this privilege and get to do all these things that the locals don't get to do. And I tell them that there is a way of doing meaningful tourism, and the local people want tourists because they depend on the tourists. But then it's only meaningful if you go to the local restaurants and you try to get to know people. And if they talk, you try to you respect that, and you return the conversation, and get to they ask questions. They're very curious about who you are. I think it's okay to tell them about yourself. And then sometimes they tell you about their lives and themselves, and those moments are very precious. So there's a way of doing it right. Avoid the chain restaurants. Try to support the local economy. That is very, very important. A lot of these places really, truly depend on tourism. So tourism is not bad. You just have to do very thoughtful, conscientious tourism.
Sure, to build off that point, I think in journalism, the traditional sense has been that journalism is about observing and not interfering, like a reporter taking a photo of a starving child before helping them.
Sorry, say that again?
Like a reporter taking a photo of a starving child instead of immediately helping them.
Yeah.
So when you go through countries like Colombia and you see people who are very underprivileged, do you think it's enough to just write about them, or do you feel like you have an obligation to do more? And then how do you balance those obligations?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think I haven't, as a
professional working journalist, been in this position yet. But in the process of reporting this book, where I was a student funded by Princeton generously to be able to do this trip, I do not make any, I do not try to feign the fact that I was not involved, that I was not very much living with people and interacting very closely with them, to the point where I was buying meals for people. I took two children at one point, two Venezuelan migrant children who I meet along, and I write kind of extensively about them. I invite them purposely to come along to lunch with us when I'm interviewing somebody, and I pay for their food and for many meals because I noticed that they weren't eating in their house, that they were fishing with this paste with a water bottle and a plastic string, and that he wasn't allowed to go home until he had 5 fish for one fish for each member of his family. And after that, I realized that I had all this food and this ability to help in that small way. So in those ways, I definitely try to. And in the world of journalism now, I mean, you guys are asking hard questions that are being asked by lots of people in the biggest news organizations in the world. But I think that that we are in a world where we're moving towards a different kind of objectivity, quote unquote, where it's not a total removal, but a moral objectivity, that you can use your sensibilities to write in a way that is fair, but also to be ethically fair in the communities where you're working. I think it's really important to ask those questions. So.
I think that one thing that is important is that when you do interview people, you tell them what the project is.
Yes.
You tell them where this is going, and you ask them, is it okay if I say this? I mean, you have to be very respectful of their privacy. So you need to, I think it is important that they know where this is going, not, just do it interrogation style, which I don't think any of you do, but really make it into a dialogue and let them know, you are teaching me something that we don't know, and you're telling me a story that needs to be told.
Right. And I think a lot of that dialogue, or the ability to listen to people, or to such that people will tell you their stories, comes from what you were saying before of being willing to be vulnerable yourself and to share more about yourself in a personal way to establish that trust in the first place, because it's not that I would show up right away and 5 minutes into the conversation, I'm asking them the deepest questions about their lives and their struggles and their challenges. No, that came on day 2 or day 3 after we spoke about my family, we spoke about their family, we spoke about our values and spent time just kind of living life, flying kites, I don't know, like normal people things, because we're all normal people. Like everybody in this book is just a normal person, and I hope that comes through. But after some time, I think we all have complexities in our lives, and those complexities kind of came forth because of the nature of what I was asking and the project at hand. So, yeah, in the back.
Could you speak, first, thank you so much. This is really enlightening. Could you just speak a little bit about your reporting and, reporting and writing process? Like, how do you like balance sort of like research and then like your experience and getting across like a message? Like, do you first go and talk to them first and then sort of develop your thesis, or did you already kind of go in knowing what you wanted to write about, and did you do a lot of like prior research and sort of fit your like experiences and your conversations into like your framework?
The question, for if people couldn't hear, was my reporting process and my writing process and kind of how I go about constructing these kinds of stories in these interactions that I'm having with people. And it does depend in every case, but I think that usually I don't go in with any kind of preconceived ideas, and I really, again, I cannot emphasize this point enough, I try to immerse myself as much as possible, spend long, long days with people until they go to bed. Like basically from when they wake up to when they go to bed, I want to be there with them. And what I do in terms of for reporting that I think is maybe a little different from what other people do is that after they go to bed and the day is over, no matter how late that is, I usually have a notebook with me, and I will spend an hour to 2 hours longhand writing very, very specifically, literally everything that happened in the entire day. Who I saw, what I met, like what was the most important, all of these things, like as if I was just like writing a letter to my mom, like telling her what went on in the day. And actually a lot of times in the transition of that notebook writing to the computer, which then becomes the actual written piece at the end, that transcription, a lot of how I synthesize those written notes into the typed notes become long chunks of what ends up in these projects. So that's a way that my reporting style is very different. And I usually, that basically allows for not going in with an idea and just knowing that I want to explore some general topic. And usually, again, in referring to those notes, gems pop up. In fact, this book exists purely because I went to Columbia once 3 years earlier through Princeton as a freshman, and I took these notes in, and the woman who I was staying with was a 96-year-old grandmother who locked the door at 7 p.m. at night and wouldn't let me leave the house after the sun went down, and I would take these long, long, long notes, and in them, people mentioned the Magdalena, and that's how I knew I wanted to go back. So hopefully that answers your question.
How much research, like outside research, did you have to do about these communities?
A lot. Yeah, I should have done more before. I should always do more before, but I think that what ends up happening is you never know what route the conversation is going to take. So I try to do as much research as I can to be knowledgeable and be able to engage in that dialogue and be informed. But then it just really depends on what happens in the day, and then the research comes afterwards for me. But that's also because of the kind of writing that I do. I think that if you're writing a targeted piece on a specific subject or a specific issue, you obviously have to be a lot more well-read going into it because you know exactly what you're meant to be writing about. Like if you're interviewing people as sources, let's say, whereas this is more like nonfiction life writing about everyday people and places. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go in the back first because he has his hand raised, and then I'll get to you. Yeah.
Yeah, on a more like positive side compared to some of the past few questions, can you like tell us about like some changed misconceptions that you probably had before, and like being there like allowed you to like, I don't know, change your way of thinking about like the country or just develop countries in a way?
Definitely. The question being about misperceptions going into it and how those perceptions changed after actually being on the ground. I think that Colombia as a country has a very specific reputation in the United States because of certain shows on Netflix, like Narcos, that when I first wanted to go, I think there was a lot of pushback from lots of different people. And the only reason I ended up going is because there was a family friend that my family knew who was Colombian and who offered for me to stay with her 96-year-old grandmother in Cali. And that ended up allowing me to, I felt more comfortable about going in the first place. But once I was there, I realized that I was operating in and dealing with a country and a people that has been vastly misunderstood over so many decades. It's a country that is so beautifully biodiverse. It's the second most biodiverse country in the world. It is many nations in one nation, which I think is a really special thing that you don't get in a lot of other places. So immediately when I went that first time, I had realized that there was something more to the place, and that's why I wanted to go back. So that change in perception happened that first time, and then it only deepened with the second trip. You had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what was the process like for you transforming your thesis into a publication? What was that process like?
The question being how, sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the question every time they're asked. But the question being, how did the thesis turn into a book, like logistically, you're saying?
Well, and how did you decide?
Oh, how do I decide? Yeah. I think that Christina can speak to this, but like when I was writing this, I think that I wanted it more to be like pieces that could be written for like magazines or newspapers, like kind of standalone chapters. At the end of the year, when I was presenting it, not at the Spanish department one, but actually at the program in journalism, they were doing their first certificate thesis, like a presentation for the graduating students. And I presented the book there, and it's like one of these stories that you never realize is going to happen to yourself when it happens. But one professor who worked for the New York Times came up to me after my presentation of this thesis, and he said, "You have to meet my agent. He'll help you turn this into a book." And I was like, wow, I can't even believe this is going to be a book. I met with the agent, decided I wanted to work with him. And then the process of actually like trying to find a publisher was really hard. Because a lot of people, and probably rightfully so, were like, no one's going to buy this. Like it's not a commercially viable book because it's on a topic that's so specific and so niche and people don't realize that they're interested in it. How are you, an unknown person, going to make this happen? I didn't have a good answer. But luckily, there was one editor at a publisher called Catapult who had the book on her desk for several weeks and hadn't gotten around to it in a while. I thought the project was dead in the water, and she called me and she said, I want to do this. This is a special project. And that's how it ended up turning into a book. So I didn't actually know that I wanted it to become a book form that like people would hold in their hands and read until that catalyst, Jim Dwyer being the amazing professor who was willing to take that chance on me, and it changed everything because now it's a book. And who could have guessed that? But that's how Princeton works a lot of times. You just have to kind of like talk about what you're doing all the time because you never know who you're talking to, and you never know like who could be the one to know the person who's going to make this into something more bigger than you could have ever imagined, maybe. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, I'm not a really old student, but I've known Jordan for a while. Given your Iraqi and Syrian background, have you thought about writing about that at all? And are you working on another book?
It's a good question. I would like to write about my Arab-Jewish background because I think that identities and conflict is something that both Christina and I are very interested in. In this country, we're told that Arabs and Jews are against each other in every way, but I feel like I'm both. And that is a really, really challenging thing to be in the world. Like I think to feel like things that you feel like you're a part of in such deep ways, being pitted against each other in every aspect of the world, and so unrightfully so, has a lot of weight to it. And so yes, I'm working on something along those themes. It's another adventure story. It deals with that. But that's all I can say at the moment. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about technology and how technology plays a role in the transformation and the identity of these people. So, do people there use phones, and then if so, how did that change their interaction in their view of themselves, and, in regards to, I guess, the outside world?
Yes, everybody had a smartphone in their hand. Everybody has Facebook, has WhatsApp. And as a result, I've been able to keep in touch with the people who I met when in the past maybe it would have been a fleeting encounter that would never happen again. In the past, I guess people would keep in touch via letters when they were doing this project, but probably not that often. I've kept in close contact with almost everybody in this book for like 3.5 years. That was the biggest way that I saw it because obviously it was like, it impacted me. But in other ways, there was a big change that I noticed from 2016, which was the first time that I was in very rural areas of the country, and 2018, which was the year that I did the Magdalena, which was that in 2016, a couple of people had smartphones. Everybody had cell phones, but had smartphones. And in 2018, everybody had smartphones. Maybe that also happened here. I think that there was a point, maybe it happened a little bit earlier here, where that was the case, where like a lot of people had those like flippy slidey phones. That was like around, I guess, when I was like a senior in college. It was like the transition when everybody started to have a smartphone. So maybe like 3 years later was when I ended up down the Magdalena, and I noticed that everybody had smartphones. And I write about that in the book, but that obviously changes the way that people operate in the world and how people communicate and how people deal with the questions of like economic problems and inequality and try to find work, and like those were all ever present, I think. Yeah. I wish I had a more specific answer for you, but off the top of my mind, that's what I've got now. Was there a question? I see somebody raising their hand in the back. No? Oh, telling me that we have to leave now? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to wrap up.
Sorry, I talked too much. But
So, no, it's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Jordan, for coming back.
Thank you for doing all this. Thank you for letting me literally go down a random river. Christina was the one. I wanted to write a thesis about crazy things. Christina reined me in just a little bit, but she still let me do something that I think most people don't get to do for a thesis project. And there's certain departments in the school where you can do crazy, I shouldn't use the word crazy, where you can do these kinds of different things. And I think because of people like Christina, the Spanish department is one of those places. So I'm happy to always talk about that. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, we can chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
So, thank you.